My mother arrived for dinner and my husband said, "Remember the rules, English only or you eat outside." She'd flown 16 hours from Seoul to visit us for the first time since our wedding 3 years ago, and my husband Christopher was standing at our front door blocking her entry until she agreed to his language policy. I don't care if she doesn't speak English well. This is America, my house, my rules. You translate everything or she doesn't come in. He said this while my 70-year-old mother stood there with her luggage smiling because she didn't understand what was happening. She's my mother. She's staying for 2 weeks. You can't expect her not to speak Korean. I tried to move past him, but he physically blocked the doorway. Then she can stay at a hotel. I told you when we got married no foreign languages in my home. It's rude and exclusionary. You agreed. He was right that I'd agreed, but only because he'd threatened to call off the wedding 2 days before if I didn't sign his ridiculous house rules document. My mother asked in Korean if everything was okay. Before I could answer, Christopher snapped, "That. Right there. That's what I'm talking about. She could be insulting me and I'd never know." He turned to my mother and spoke slowly and loudly like she was deaf instead of Korean. "English. Only English." My mother looked confused and tried her limited English. Sorry, I no understand." Christopher rolled his eyes. "Great. 2 weeks of this. Your daughter should have taught you basic English before coming to my country." Our neighbor Patricia was getting her mail and watching the scene. Christopher noticed and called out, "Patricia, you understand, right? It's disrespectful when people speak foreign languages in front of you." Patricia looked uncomfortable. "Chris, she's her mother. Let them speak Korean." But Christopher was already on his soapbox. "This is the problem with America. We're too accommodating. My grandfather came here from Ireland and learned English in 6 months. No excuses." He turned back to my mother. "You want dinner? You speak English? You want to watch TV? English? You want to talk to your daughter? English. Otherwise you can use the guest house out back." The guest house was a converted shed with no heating. It was November. "You're not putting my mother in the shed, Chris." But he pulled out his phone and showed me a document. Our house agreement. Section 3, paragraph 2. All communication in shared spaces must be in English. You signed this. My mother tried to wheel her suitcase back toward the taxi that was pulling away, but I grabbed her arm. "We're going inside, Mom," I said in Korean. Christopher immediately started counting. "That's 1 strike. 3 strikes and she's out. I'm serious. I installed a language app on my phone that detects non-English speech. Every violation gets logged." He actually showed me the app. He'd been recording us. "You've been recording my mother without consent?" He shrugged. "My house, my rules. Don't like it? You both can leave. But you're not taking the car. That's in my name. Or the credit cards. Those are mine too. Good luck getting a hotel with your teacher salary." My mother understood enough to know we were fighting about her. She tried again in broken English. "I go hotel. No problem for you." Christopher clapped mockingly. "See? She can speak English when she tries. Amazing how that works." His mother Helen pulled up in her car. She was supposed to join us for dinner. "What's everyone doing outside?" Christopher immediately put on his victim voice. "Helen, thank God you're here. They're trying to make me feel guilty for wanting English spoken in my own home. You understand, right? When your parents spoke Polish, you made them learn English." Helen got out of her car. "My parents already lived here for 20 years, Christopher. This woman just arrived. And I never banned Polish. That would be cruel." Christopher's face went red. "You're taking their side? My own mother?" He turned to my mother and actually started yelling. "You want to speak Korean? Fine. But every word costs $1. I'll put a jar on the table. Like a swear jar, but for foreign language. That money goes toward English classes." My mother looked at me with tears in her eyes. She understood more than he thought. She said quietly in English, "I understand you." Then in perfect English she continued, "I understand you perfectly. I have PhD in linguistics from Seoul National University. I taught English for 30 years before retiring. I speak 4 languages fluently." Everyone went silent. Christopher's mouth opened, but no words came out. My mother continued, "I spoke Korean to my daughter because that's our heart language. The language of her childhood. The language of her father who died when she was 10. The language that connects her to her culture. But you want to steal that from her? From us?" She pulled out her phone and showed something to Helen. "This is an email from your son. He wrote to me last month saying if I speak Korean during the visit, he will divorce my daughter and she'll get nothing because of the prenup agreement he made her sign. He said he'd film every Korean word as evidence of disrespect. He threatened to destroy my daughter's life if I spoke my own language to my own child." Helen grabbed the phone and read it. Her face went white. Helen's hands shook as she scrolled through the email again, her finger moving across the screen like she couldn't believe what she was reading. Her face changed from shock to something harder, something that looked like she was seeing her son for the first time in years. Christopher started talking fast, his words tumbling over each other about context and misunderstanding, but Helen held up her hand. Shut your mouth right now. My mother pulled out her phone and swiped through several screens with the calm precision of someone who'd prepared for this exact moment. She spoke in perfect English, her accent minimal and her tone professional. She explained that she'd documented everything from the moment Christopher sent that threatening email 3 weeks ago. She turned her phone toward Helen and showed her additional emails where Christopher had researched ways to enforce the prenup, discussing my teaching salary and using phrases like barely enough to survive on and financial leverage. Helen's face went from white to gray as she read her son's calculated cruelty spelled out in his own words. Patricia walked across her lawn toward us, her mail still in her hand. She called out asking if everything was okay, her voice tight with concern. Helen turned to her and spoke loudly enough for the whole street to hear. She said her son had been financially abusing his wife and threatening his mother-in-law. Christopher lunged toward his mother's phone, but Patricia stepped between them faster than I expected and told him she was calling the police if he didn't calm down immediately. She already had her phone in her other hand. I found my voice somewhere in my chest where it had been hiding for 3 years. I told Christopher I wanted him to leave the house tonight. He laughed, the sound sharp and mean. He reminded me that the house was in his name, the car was in his name, and I'd signed away my rights to everything. Helen interrupted him mid-sentence and said she'd co-sign the mortgage, and she'd be calling the bank first thing Monday morning to explore her options as a co-owner. Christopher's laugh died in his throat. His confidence cracked like ice under pressure. He switched tactics so fast it gave me whiplash, his face crumpling as tears started running down his cheeks. He said his father had treated his mother terribly, and he'd sworn he'd never be like that. Helen's expression hardened further, her jaw setting in a way that made her look 10 years older and infinitely stronger. She told him he'd become exactly like his father, controlling and manipulative and convinced it was all for everyone's good. My mother suggested we all go inside and discuss this calmly, rather than providing neighborhood entertainment. Helen agreed immediately, and told Christopher he could come inside only if he sat down and stayed quiet while the adults talked. The way she said adults, deliberately excluding her 35-year-old son from that category, cut deeper than any insult could have. Christopher's face flushed red, but he nodded. Inside, I pulled the prenuptial agreement from the drawer in the kitchen, where Christopher kept all our important documents. My mother examined it with the focused attention of someone who'd spent decades analyzing language for a living. Helen read over her shoulder, her finger following the text. My mother pointed out several clauses that used deliberately confusing language designed to obscure what I was actually agreeing to. Helen asked if I'd had a lawyer review this before signing. I admitted that Christopher said we couldn't afford 2 lawyers, and his attorney represented both our interests. Helen closed her eyes like the words physically hurt her. She immediately pulled out her phone and called someone named Scott, who apparently helped her with her own divorce from Christopher's father. She explained the situation in quick, precise sentences and asked if he could look at the prenup as an emergency favor. Scott must have agreed because Helen's shoulders relaxed slightly. She said she was paying his fees as an apology for raising a son who turned out like this. We had an appointment for tomorrow morning at his office. Christopher tried to argue that the prenup was legal and binding, that I'd signed it voluntarily. My mother countered in her professor voice, the one that brooked no argument and commanded lecture halls. She said that signing under duress 2 days before a wedding with threats of cancellation hardly constituted voluntary consent. Her delivery was devastating, each word precisely chosen and weighted. She'd clearly testified as an expert witness before because she knew exactly how to dismantle an argument. Someone knocked on the door. Patricia stood there with her husband Mike, a tall man with kind eyes who I'd only spoken to a handful of times. She said they'd heard raised voices and wanted to make sure everyone was safe. Christopher immediately put on his reasonable husband face and started to explain, but Patricia cut him off. She said she'd watched him control me for 3 years, and she was glad someone finally called him out. Mike added that the whole neighborhood had noticed Christopher's behavior and found it disturbing. He said it quietly but firmly, like he'd been waiting for this conversation for a long time. Helen turned to Christopher and her voice came out flat and cold. She told him to pack a bag and stay at a hotel tonight because the women needed space to figure things out. Christopher's face went red and he said this was his house and nobody could kick him out. Helen stepped closer to him and said the mortgage had her co-signature, and her money paid the down payment, so he could leave on his own, or she'd have Patricia's husband help him leave. Mike crossed his arms and his 6'3" frame suddenly looked much bigger in our small entryway. Christopher looked between his mother and Mike, and something in his expression shifted from anger to calculation. He pulled out his phone and started tapping on it while walking toward the bedroom. We heard drawers opening and closing, the sound of a suitcase zipper. He came back 10 minutes later with an overnight bag and stopped in front of me. He said I'd regret this, and he had documentation of every penny he'd spent on me over 3 years. My mother said something in Korean that made Helen look at her with raised eyebrows. Helen asked what she said, and I translated that my mother said, "Small men count pennies while real men build partnerships." Helen laughed for the first time all evening, a genuine sound that seemed to surprise even her. Christopher's jaw clenched and he walked out without another word. We heard his car start and pull away. The adrenaline that had been holding me together suddenly drained away, and I started crying. Not quiet tears, but full-body sobs that shook my shoulders and made it hard to breathe. The reality crashed over me all at once. I had maybe $3,000 in my checking account, student loans that took a chunk of every paycheck, and a teacher's salary that barely covered my car payment and groceries when Christopher wasn't controlling everything. Helen wrapped her arms around me and said we'd figure out the financial pieces together. My mother took my hand and said in English that I survived losing my father when I was 10, and I'd survive losing Christopher too. She squeezed my fingers and I realized she was right. I'd lived through worse than this. That night, the three of us sat at the kitchen table with notepads and pens spread between us. Helen started talking about her divorce from Christopher's father, and the similarities made my stomach hurt. She described the same control tactics, the same financial manipulation, the way he'd made her feel like she couldn't survive without him. She said the prenup he'd forced her to sign looked intimidating, but she eventually got a fair settlement because several clauses were illegal. My mother shared memories of my father and how despite dying young, he never once made her feel small or controlled. She said he celebrated her PhD, encouraged her teaching career, learned Korean cooking so she wouldn't get homesick. I sat there listening to these two women and realized I'd been living with abuse disguised as household rules. Christopher hadn't been protecting his home or his culture. He'd been isolating me and erasing parts of my identity so I'd be easier to control. The next morning, my phone rang while I was making coffee. Veronica from the school was calling because we'd planned to meet for coffee and I'd completely forgotten. I answered and my voice broke immediately. I told her everything in a rush of words that probably didn't make much sense. She said her husband Scott was a family law attorney and she was coming over right now. I stopped mid-sentence because Scott was the same name Helen had called last night. Veronica had been my colleague for 2 years, and I'd never known her husband could help with exactly this situation. She said she'd be there in 20 minutes. Veronica arrived with a box of pastries and the kind of calm energy that made everything feel slightly more manageable. She looked at my mother and said something in Korean that made my mother's eyes widen. My mother responded in Korean, and they had a brief conversation while I stood there confused. Veronica turned to me and explained her Korean grandmother had taught her the language growing up. She said she was glad someone finally stood up to Christopher because she'd watched him control me for years, and it had made her angry. I felt stunned by this connection I never knew existed. This whole part of Veronica's life I'd never asked about because Christopher had trained me not to share anything personal at work. We all drove to Scott's office in the financial district downtown. His legal team spent 2 hours reviewing the prenup while we sat in a conference room drinking water from tiny paper cups. Scott finally came back and explained that several clauses were likely unenforceable due to lack of independent counsel, signing under duress, and unconscionable terms. He said we had a strong case to challenge it, but litigation would take months and cost money. Helen immediately pulled out her checkbook and wrote a retainer check. She told Scott to do whatever it took, and she was paying as an apology for raising a son who turned out like this. Scott walked me through the immediate steps. Document everything Christopher had done or said. Open a separate bank account at a different bank. Change all my passwords. Consider a restraining order if Christopher escalated. He drove me to a bank across town that afternoon and helped me open an account in just my name. I transferred my teaching salary there, and it felt terrifying and empowering at the same time. This was the first money Christopher wouldn't have access to in 3 years. The first money that was truly mine. My mother announced she was staying for 6 months instead of 2 weeks. Her visitor visa allowed it, and she said she was using the whole time to help me through this. I tried to protest because she had her life and soul, her friends, her routine. She said her daughter's safety was her life right now, and everything else could wait. Helen offered to let us both stay at her house since it was larger, and Christopher wouldn't dare show up there. We accepted because the alternative was going back to the house where Christopher might return, despite what his mother said. My phone started buzzing constantly with texts from Christopher. The first few were apologies saying he overreacted and we could work through this. Then accusations that I was turning his mother against him. Then promises to go to therapy and change. Then reminders that I'd signed the prenup and would lose everything. Scott told me to stop responding completely and save every message as evidence. I watched the texts come in and saw the pattern clearly now. The desperate apologies mixed with threats. The promises mixed with blame. The real person behind the controlled facade was showing himself, and it was uglier than I'd imagined. Monday morning, I walked into the school building with my stomach twisted into knots. The weekend at Helen's house had been quiet but tense, my mother and I both trying to process everything that had happened. I checked my mailbox in the office and found a note asking me to see the principal before first period. My hands started shaking as I walked down the hallway to her office. Mrs. Daniels had been principal for 12 years and I'd worked under her for 5 of them. She smiled when I entered, but her expression was serious. She closed the door behind me and gestured for me to sit down. Someone had called the school board on Friday afternoon claiming I was having a mental breakdown and shouldn't be around children. The caller said I was emotionally unstable, going through a divorce and making erratic decisions that put students at risk. Mrs. Daniels said she knew immediately it was nonsense because she'd worked with me long enough to know my character. but the board required her to document the complaint and inform me that someone was trying to damage my reputation. I felt sick listening to her explain the process. Christopher was already attacking my job, the one thing that gave me independence and financial security. Mrs. Daniels asked if I was okay and if there was anything she needed to know about my personal situation. I took a deep breath and told her I was separating from my husband, and he was becoming vindictive. She nodded slowly and said she'd suspected something was wrong based on how controlled I'd seemed the past few years. She promised to document everything properly and assured me my job was secure as long as I continued performing my duties professionally. I thanked her and left her office feeling exposed, but also relieved that she believed me. During my planning period, I found Veronica in the teacher's lounge and told her what happened. She looked furious and said Christopher was escalating exactly like Scott predicted he would. She suggested I get ahead of the situation by being honest with a few trusted colleagues about what was happening. That way, if Christopher tried spreading lies, people would already know the truth. I felt resistant at first because I'd spent 3 years hiding the reality of my marriage. But Veronica pointed out that shame only worked in Christopher's favor, and transparency would protect me. I thought about it during lunch and then approached 3 teachers I'd worked closely with over the years. We met in my classroom after school and I told them everything. The English-only rule, the prenup signed under duress, the threatening email to my mother, the financial control. 2 of them started crying and shared their own stories of leaving controlling relationships years ago. One had been married to a man who monitored her mileage and demanded receipts for every purchase. Another had a boyfriend who isolated her from friends and family using guilt and manipulation. They both said the hardest part was admitting what was happening, because they felt stupid for not seeing it sooner. We sat in my classroom for over an hour talking about patterns of control and how common it was, and how much shame kept women isolated. I realized I wasn't alone in this experience, and that sharing it actually made me stronger rather than weaker. That evening, my phone started buzzing with new texts from Christopher. The tone had shifted from desperate apologies to outright threats. He said he had private information about me that would ruin my career if I didn't come home and work things out. He said he'd been documenting my behavior for months, and had evidence of me being an unfit wife and teacher. He said I'd regret turning his mother against him, and that I'd lose everything in the divorce. I showed the text to Scott when he stopped by Helen's house that night. He read through them carefully and said this was exactly what we needed for a restraining order. The threats were specific enough, and the pattern was clear enough that a judge would grant protection. Scott filed the paperwork the next morning, and we had a hearing scheduled for Thursday. The judge reviewed the threatening texts, the email to my mother and Christopher's attempt to damage my professional reputation. She granted a temporary restraining order within 48 hours of Scott filing. Christopher was legally required to stay at least 500 feet away from me, my workplace, and Helen's house. He couldn't contact me directly or indirectly through third parties. Violating the order would result in immediate arrest. I felt safer knowing there was legal protection in place, but also scared about how Christopher would react to being restrained. My phone rang that afternoon from a number I didn't recognize. I answered and heard my Aunt Karen's voice. My mother had called her sister and told her everything that was happening. Karen lived one town over in a small apartment, and I hadn't seen her much during my marriage because Christopher always found reasons why we couldn't visit my relatives. She said she had a spare bedroom if we needed additional space or wanted to stay somewhere Christopher didn't know about. She'd already cooked a huge pot of kimchi jjigae and was bringing it over that evening. When she arrived at Helen's house with containers of Korean food, I started crying. 3 years of isolation from my family had made me forget what it felt like to have people show up without being asked. Karen hugged me tight and said in Korean that family protects family, and she should have pushed harder to stay involved in my life. She'd sensed something was wrong, but Christopher had been so good at making excuses and controlling access. My mother and Karen spent the evening cooking together in Helen's kitchen, while Helen watched and asked questions about the recipes. Having multiple generations of women supporting me felt overwhelming in the best way possible. 2 weeks after the initial confrontation at the front door, we had our first mediation session at the courthouse. Christopher arrived with an attorney who wore an expensive suit and carried a leather briefcase that probably cost more than my monthly salary. The attorney immediately started trying to intimidate us by talking about how strong Christopher's position was and how the prenup was ironclad. Scott sat calmly and let him finish his speech. Then Scott opened his folder and presented copies of the threatening email to my mother, the texts threatening my career, the documentation of financial abuse, and the restraining order. He explained in a measured tone that the prenup was signed under duress, that Christopher had isolated me from legal counsel, and that several clauses were likely unconscionable. He also mentioned that we had multiple witnesses to Christopher's controlling behavior, and that his own mother was prepared to testify about patterns she'd observed. The mediator, a woman in her 60s with gray hair and sharp eyes, listened to both sides, and then suggested Christopher's attorney speak privately with his client about the weakness of his position. They left the room for 20 minutes while we waited. During the break, Christopher tried to approach me in the courthouse hallway. His attorney had gone to make a phone call, and Christopher walked right up to me despite the restraining order. He started crying and begging me to come home. He said he'd go to therapy and change, and that we could work through this if I just gave him another chance. I stood there frozen while Scott positioned himself between us. Then Christopher's tone shifted completely, and he started accusing my mother of destroying our marriage. He said she'd poisoned me against him, and that I was ungrateful for everything he'd provided. The switch from sobbing apologies to angry blame happened so fast it gave me whiplash. Scott told him to step back and reminded him about the restraining order. Christopher kept talking, saying I'd never survive on my own, and that I needed him whether I admitted it or not. His face was red and his voice was getting louder. Other people in the hallway were starting to stare. Helen came around the corner from the bathroom and saw what was happening. She walked straight up to Christopher and told him she was ashamed of the man he'd become. Her voice was quiet but firm. She said his father's abuse didn't excuse his own behavior, and that she wouldn't enable him anymore by providing financial support or emotional cover. She said she'd spent years making excuses for his controlling tendencies and convincing herself he was just particular or organized. But seeing him threaten my career and attack my mother had opened her eyes to who he really was. Christopher started to argue, but Helen cut him off. She said she was done listening to his justifications and rationalizations. His attorney came rushing back down the hallway and grabbed Christopher's arm, clearly worried about what he might say or do in such a public setting. He pulled Christopher back toward the mediation room, while Christopher kept looking over his shoulder at his mother with an expression of complete shock. The mediation session resumed, and Scott negotiated a temporary agreement. I could return to the house to collect my belongings as long as Christopher stayed away during the designated time. We set a date for the following Saturday, and Scott specified that I could bring helpers to make the process faster. Christopher's attorney agreed reluctantly, and the mediator documented everything. When we left the courthouse, I felt exhausted, but also relieved that I'd be able to get my things without confrontation. Helen, my mother, Veronica, and Karen's daughter Yuri all volunteered to help me pack. Yuri was 26 and worked in logistics, so she knew how to organize a move efficiently. We made a plan to arrive early Saturday morning with boxes and pack everything as quickly as possible. Saturday morning, we pulled up to the house I'd lived in for 3 years, and it felt strange and foreign. Christopher's car wasn't in the driveway per the agreement. We went inside, and I was immediately struck by how little of the space actually felt like mine. Christopher had controlled every decorating decision, every furniture purchase, every color choice. The walls were the gray he'd insisted on. The couch was the leather sectional he'd wanted. The artwork was abstract pieces he'd selected. My contributions had been slowly erased over time until the house reflected only his taste and preferences. We worked efficiently, packing my clothes, books, and personal items into boxes. Helen handled the kitchen while my mother sorted through bathroom supplies. Veronica and Yuri tackled the bedroom closet where most of my teaching materials were stored. I went into Christopher's office to grab a few items I'd left on the desk. While looking through drawers, I found a folder labeled with my name. Inside were printouts of my emails going back 6 months, text message screenshots between me and friends, GPS logs from my phone showing everywhere I'd been. He'd been monitoring me far more extensively than I'd realized. There were notes in his handwriting analyzing my communications and tracking my movements. I felt sick looking at the evidence of surveillance. Scott had come along to supervise the process, and I called him into the office. He photographed every page as evidence of the controlling behavior. He said this level of monitoring without consent could be relevant to the divorce proceedings. I felt violated all over again knowing Christopher had been reading my private conversations and tracking my location without my knowledge. We finished packing by early afternoon and loaded everything into a rental truck Yuri had arranged. We drove to a storage unit across town where I could keep my belongings while I figured out next steps. Helen insisted we continue staying at her house, but I knew I needed to start looking for my own place. That evening, my mother and I sat down with a notebook and created a realistic budget based on my teacher salary. We calculated rent, utilities, groceries, student loan payments, and basic expenses. It would be tight but manageable if I found a small apartment and was careful with spending. For the first time, I could see a path forward that didn't depend on Christopher's money or control. I could actually survive independently, and that realization felt both terrifying and empowering. I started apartment hunting the next week, scrolling through rental listings on my phone during lunch breaks at the school. Most places near my school were either too expensive or in bad neighborhoods. My mother sat beside me at Helen's kitchen table and pointed out a 2-bedroom unit that looked promising. The rent was just barely manageable on my teacher salary if I was careful with spending. We scheduled a viewing for Saturday morning, and I felt nervous about committing to something so permanent. The apartment complex was older but well-maintained, with a small playground and laundry room on site. The landlord showed us the second-floor unit, and I could immediately picture my mother and me living there. 2 small bedrooms, a combined kitchen and living area, 1 bathroom with outdated tile but everything functional. The landlord ran my credit and called my references, then offered me the lease starting in 2 weeks. I signed the papers right there before I could talk myself out of it. Scott called 3 days later with news about the settlement negotiations. He put me on speaker in his office while Veronica sat beside me for support. Christopher's attorney had sent over an official offer in writing. 50-50 split of all marital assets, uncontested divorce, but only if I signed a non-disclosure agreement about Christopher's behavior during the marriage. Scott explained that the NDA was clearly Christopher trying to protect his reputation and public image. The document would prevent me from discussing the financial abuse, the surveillance, the controlling behavior, or the threatening emails to my mother. Scott said I had significant leverage here because Christopher's behavior was well documented, and he knew a court battle would expose everything publicly. I asked what Scott recommended, and he said I should counter with better terms, since Christopher obviously wanted this settled quietly and quickly. I spent that evening drafting my counteroffer with Scott's guidance over email. I wanted 60% of the home equity since Helen's money had funded the entire down payment, and I'd contributed to 3 years of mortgage payments. I wanted the car titled in my name instead of Christopher's since I needed reliable transportation for work. And I absolutely refused to sign any NDA because Christopher could protect his reputation by actually changing his behavior instead of silencing me. Scott reviewed my demands and said they were reasonable given the circumstances and evidence we had. He sent the counteroffer to Christopher's attorney the next morning. My mother announced at breakfast that she wanted to do something productive while we waited for the divorce proceedings. She'd contacted the local community center and offered to teach Korean language classes. The director had enthusiastically agreed and scheduled her for Tuesday and Thursday evenings starting next week. My mother asked if I wanted to be her first student, and I said yes immediately. Veronica overheard us talking about it at the school and asked if she could join too. Within days, my mother had 5 students enrolled, including me, Veronica, and 3 other teachers from my school. The first class met in a small room at the community center with folding chairs arranged in a circle. My mother taught us basic greetings and introductions, but she also wove in Korean history and cultural context. She explained how language carries identity and memory, how speaking Korean connected me to my father, who died when I was 10. I felt something shift inside me as I practiced the words I'd been afraid to speak in my own home for 3 years. Veronica struggled with pronunciation, but laughed at her mistakes and kept trying. The other teachers asked questions about Korean culture and food and customs. My mother glowed with the energy of teaching again after being retired. She told stories about her students in Seoul and her research in linguistics. I realized Christopher had tried to erase this entire part of who I was, and reclaiming it felt like breathing properly for the first time in years. Scott called again 10 days later with Christopher's response to my counteroffer. Christopher's attorney had come back with a revised proposal. 55% equity split instead of 60%, the car titled in my name as requested, and dropping the NDA requirement entirely. Scott said this was actually a reasonable compromise that would avoid expensive and lengthy litigation. He explained that going to court could take months and cost tens of thousands in legal fees, with no guarantee I'd get a better outcome. The 55% split was fair given the circumstances, and getting the car and avoiding the NDA were significant wins. I asked if this meant Christopher was giving up on controlling the narrative, and Scott said Christopher's attorney had probably explained that the NDA made him look guilty, and wouldn't hold up anyway given all the documented evidence. I accepted the revised offer that same day. Scott said the divorce would be finalized in 60 days once all the paperwork was processed through the court system. The apartment keys arrived in my mailbox 2 weeks later in a small envelope from the property management company. I drove over after school with my mother, and we stood outside the building looking up at the second-floor windows. My mother squeezed my hand and said in Korean that this was the beginning of my real life. We climbed the stairs, and I unlocked the door to the empty apartment. The afternoon sunlight came through the living room windows and made patterns on the worn carpet. I walked through each room slowly, touching the walls, opening closet doors, checking cabinet space in the kitchen. This was mine. Nobody could threaten to take it away or use it to control me. I stood in the middle of the empty living room and started crying, but this time the tears felt different. Not fear or grief, but relief mixed with exhaustion. My mother hugged me and said in Korean that this was my space where I made the rules, where I spoke any language I wanted, where I decided who was welcome. We spent the rest of the afternoon measuring rooms and making lists of furniture we needed. Helen arrived with her truck full of basic supplies she'd bought as a housewarming gift. Dish soap and paper towels and cleaning supplies and a coffee maker. Veronica showed up with takeout containers of Thai food and a bottle of wine. We sat on the floor eating pad thai and talking about paint colors and furniture arrangements. That night, my mother and I slept on air mattresses Helen had lent us, and I felt more peaceful than I had in years. The restraining order was still active, which meant Christopher had to stay at least 500 feet away from me, Helen's house, my school, and now my new apartment. I'd started to relax slightly, thinking maybe he'd finally accepted that the marriage was over. I was teaching my 4th period English class about narrative structure when the school secretary knocked on my door looking worried. She whispered that there was a situation in the main office and I needed to come immediately. I left my students with an assignment and followed her down the hallway. Through the office windows, I could see Christopher arguing with our school security guard. My principal stood between them with her phone in her hand. Christopher saw me and started yelling about how I'd turned everyone against him and he just wanted to talk. The security guard told him to leave the property immediately, or they'd call the police. Christopher ignored the warning and tried to push past the guard toward where I stood frozen in the doorway. The guard physically blocked him while the principal called the police. Christopher kept yelling that I was his wife and he had a right to see me, that the restraining order was ridiculous and unfair. 2 police officers arrived within minutes and arrested Christopher for violating the restraining order. They handcuffed him in the school parking lot while students watched from classroom windows. My principal walked me back to her office and offered me the rest of the day off, but I said I wanted to finish teaching my classes. I called Scott for my planning period and told him what happened. Scott said this actually strengthened our position significantly, and he'd file paperwork to extend the restraining order for another full year. He also said Christopher's attorney would likely advise him very strongly to stop all contact, because this arrest showed he couldn't control himself. My mother's Korean language class kept growing as word spread through the community center. By the 4th week, she had 15 students ranging from complete beginners to people with Korean heritage who wanted to reconnect with the language. The community center director asked her to add a second class on Saturday mornings to accommodate the demand. My mother agreed and seemed to thrive on the schedule and structure. She told me over dinner one night that she'd missed teaching more than she realized after retiring. She admitted she was considering staying in the United States longer term instead of returning to Seoul. She asked what I thought about her applying for extended residency with my sponsorship. I said I'd love to have her nearby and we could look into the immigration requirements together. She smiled and said she felt useful again, like she had a purpose beyond just being someone's mother or someone's widow. The divorce hearing was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in early March. Scott met me at the courthouse and explained the process would be brief since everything was already agreed upon. Christopher didn't attend, having his attorney represent him instead. The judge reviewed the settlement agreement and asked if I understood the terms and agreed to them voluntarily. I said yes. The judge signed the papers and stamped them with the official seal. Just like that, I was no longer married. The whole process took maybe 15 minutes. Helen had taken the morning off work to be there, and she hugged me in the courthouse hallway afterward. She apologized again for not seeing her son's behavior sooner, for not understanding what he'd become. I told her she'd been the mother-in-law I needed when it mattered most, that she'd stood up for me when her own son wouldn't. We walked out of the courthouse together into the cold March morning, and I felt lighter than I had in years. The equity settlement check arrived by certified mail 3 weeks later. I opened the envelope at my kitchen table with my mother watching. The amount was enough to furnish my apartment properly and build an emergency fund of several $1,000s. For the first time in years, I had financial security that no one could threaten to take away. I went to the bank that afternoon and opened a savings account in my name only. I deposited most of the check and kept some for immediate furniture needs. The bank teller congratulated me on the account opening, and I thanked her without explaining why it felt so significant. I sat in my car in the bank parking lot afterward and looked at the account balance on my phone. This money was mine. I'd earned it through 3 years of contributing to a marriage and a home. Nobody could use it to control me or manipulate me or make me feel small. I started planning for a future I actually controlled, making lists of goals and dreams I'd pushed aside during my marriage. Maybe I'd take summer classes to get my master's degree. Maybe I'd travel to Seoul with my mother and scatter some of my father's ashes there. Maybe I'd just exist peacefully in my small apartment, speaking whatever language I wanted and making my own decisions. The possibilities felt endless and terrifying and wonderful all at once. 3 months passed and spring arrived with cherry blossoms blooming outside my classroom windows. I stood at the front of my classroom explaining the Family Heritage Project to my students. They needed to interview someone about their cultural background and present what they learned. A quiet girl named Maria raised her hand and asked if I spoke any other languages besides English. I smiled and told her yes. I spoke Korean fluently. The classroom went quiet as I explained that Korean was my first language, the language my father spoke to me before he died when I was 10, the language that connected me to my mother and my heritage. Maria's face lit up and she said her abuela only spoke Spanish, and she sometimes felt embarrassed about it. 3 other students nodded, and one boy said his parents spoke Tagalog at home, but he pretended not to understand it at the school. I told them that speaking multiple languages was a gift, that maintaining connections to their cultures made them richer people, not less American. After class, 5 students stayed behind to tell me about their families and the languages they spoke at home. They seemed relieved to have permission to be proud of who they were. The following Saturday, my mother and I spent all morning cooking in our small apartment kitchen. We prepared bulgogi, japchae, kimchi pancakes, and my mother's famous Korean fried chicken. Helen arrived first carrying a bottle of wine and a nervous smile. She admitted she had never tried Korean food before and hoped she used the chopsticks correctly. Veronica and Scott came next with flowers and their genuine warmth that always made me feel safe. Karen and Yuri brought traditional Korean rice cakes from a bakery they found across town. Patricia and Mike from the old neighborhood showed up with a store-bought cake because Patricia said she felt bad coming empty-handed. My mother set up the dining table with small bowls of banchan side dishes and taught everyone how to say basic phrases. Helen repeated the Korean words carefully, trying to get the pronunciation right, and my mother corrected her gently with patience. We ate together and laughed as people struggled with chopsticks and asked questions about the food. Helen told a story about Christopher refusing to eat anything that wasn't American food when he was growing up, and how she wished she had challenged that attitude instead of accommodating it. My mother squeezed her hand and said we all make mistakes with our children, but what matters is what we do when we finally see clearly. I watched these people who had become my family sharing food and stories, and I felt something I had not felt in years. I belonged somewhere that accepted all of me. The next week, Helen showed up at my mother's Korean language class at the community center. My mother looked surprised, but pleased as Helen took a seat in the front row with her notebook ready. After class, Helen explained that she wanted to understand the culture her son had tried to erase from my life. She said learning Korean was her way of honoring the part of me that Christopher had attacked. Over the following weeks, Helen became my mother's most dedicated student, staying after class to practice pronunciation and asking questions about Korean history and customs. I watched them develop an unlikely friendship built on their shared experiences with controlling men and their determination to do better for the next generation. My mother told me one evening that Helen reminded her of her own mother, who had survived the Korean War and refused to let trauma make her bitter. Helen confided that my mother gave her hope that she could still be useful and relevant, instead of just Christopher's embarrassed parent. They met for coffee between classes and talked about everything from recipes to their late husbands to their regrets about not standing up sooner. I felt grateful that something good had emerged from all the pain. I was shopping for groceries on a Saturday afternoon when I saw Christopher in the produce section. He looked thinner than I remembered and tired around the eyes. My mother was with me picking out vegetables for dinner, and she noticed him at the same time I did. Christopher started walking toward us and opened his mouth to speak. I turned my cart and walked past him to another aisle without saying anything. My mother squeezed my hand as we moved away, and she did not need to say anything because her presence was enough. I heard Christopher call my name, but I kept walking and focused on my shopping list. My mother asked quietly in Korean if I was okay, and I told her yes. I was better than okay. I did not owe Christopher conversation or closure or forgiveness. He was part of my past, and I was building a future without him. We finished shopping and drove home, and I realized I felt nothing when I saw him. No anger or sadness or regret, just emptiness where he used to live in my thoughts. 6 months had passed since I left Christopher, and I woke up one morning genuinely happy. My apartment felt like home with its mismatched furniture and Korean art on the walls, and the smell of my mother's cooking always in the air. My job brought me satisfaction as I watched my students grow and learn to be proud of their identities. My friendships with Veronica, Helen, Karen, and Patricia had deepened into real bonds built on honesty and mutual support. My relationship with my mother had transformed from parent and child into an adult partnership where we supported each other equally. I still had moments of anxiety when I checked my bank account, or worried about making rent, or wondered if I could trust people. I was working through those issues in therapy every week with a counselor who specialized in financial abuse and control. Some days were harder than others, but the hard days were getting fewer, and the good days were getting better. I was learning to make decisions without fear of punishment, and to speak my mind without calculating consequences. I was becoming the person I might have been if I had never met Christopher. My mother announced over breakfast that she wanted to apply for permanent residency in the United States. She said she had built a life here teaching Korean language and culture, and she wanted to stay near me. I felt tears in my eyes as I told her I would sponsor her application, and we could start the paperwork immediately. Scott offered to help with the immigration forms when I mentioned it at our next dinner together, and he said these cases usually took several months, but he was optimistic about approval. My mother's community center classes had expanded to 3 sessions per week, and she had over 30 regular students now. She felt useful again, like she had a purpose beyond just being someone's mother or someone's widow. We talked one evening about bringing some of my father's ashes from Seoul to scatter somewhere meaningful in our new home. My mother said my father would be proud of how I had survived and rebuilt my life. She said he had always worried about leaving us alone, but he would see now that we were stronger than either of us knew. The school year ended in June, and my principal called me into her office. She asked if I would lead a professional development session for teachers on creating inclusive classrooms that honored students' cultural identities. I felt nervous but excited as I agreed, and immediately started planning the workshop. My mother helped me design the content using her linguistics expertise and her decades of teaching experience. We created activities that helped teachers recognize their own biases and learn strategies for celebrating diversity instead of just tolerating it. The workshop happened in August before the new school year started, and 20 teachers attended. They engaged actively with the material, and several came up afterward to share their own experiences with cultural identity in education. The principal told me the district office heard about the session and wanted me to present it district-wide next year. I drove home that day feeling proud of myself and grateful for my mother's partnership in creating something meaningful. What would have been my 4th wedding anniversary fell on a Tuesday in September. I took the day off work and instead celebrated my 6-month independence anniversary. Veronica, my mother, Helen, Karen, and Yuri came over for dinner that evening. We ate Korean food and spoke whatever languages we wanted without fear or shame. Helen practiced her Korean phrases, and everyone clapped when she successfully ordered more kimchi in halting but correct Korean. Veronica told stories about her own grandmother's immigration experience and how language had been both a barrier and a bridge. Karen shared memories of my father and how he had loved watching me grow up bilingual and bicultural. Yuri talked about her own struggles with identity as a second-generation immigrant and how my story had inspired her to reconnect with her heritage. We raised our glasses and toasted to the family we choose and the strength we did not know we had until we needed it. I looked around at these women who had helped me escape and rebuild, and I knew with absolute certainty that I was exactly where I was supposed to be.